Chapter 9. You what? Paul said. The girl of your dreams, she repeated. Oh, come on, Paul, get a grip. I've been visiting you since you were 13. You should know me by now. Paul sat up, trying to get a better look at her face, but she shifted a little and the light dazzled him. Sorry, he said, but you aren't at all familiar, and I think I'd remember if I'd seen you, he added awkwardly. She giggled. Silly, she said. That's just you. You always forget your dreams the moment you wake up. Pity, she added, in a tone of voice that he couldn't quite identify, but which made the hairs on the back of his neck curl. Some of them were really nice. You should dream more often. You know that? She'd said Paul, he thought. She could say names without doing the whole salted slug bit. I still don't follow, he said. If you like a recurring dream or something, how come I can see you now I'm awake? I am awake, he added, mostly to himself. I can feel the pins and needles in my arm. Ouch, he said, by way of vindication. Of course you're awake, she replied. That's why you don't recognise me. Nice pyjamas, by the way. A lot of men couldn't get away with red paisley. What happened to the green and brown check? You always look good in those. They got frayed. I threw them out. He stopped, dead. How the hell do you know about my pyjamas? He snapped. You're not real, are you? She raised an eyebrow. Paul slowly turned a deep puce colour and pulled the sheet up to his neck. Anyhow, she went on, since you aren't going to do the to what do I owe the pleasure bit, I'd better just tell you. Listening? Paul nodded. Splendid. Right, here goes. She pursed her lips and took a deep breath. You want to know why I'm here, right? Well, we couldn't help overhearing. We don't eavesdrop as a rule, but it was pretty hard to miss, really. You were thinking, why should you get mixed up in all the stuff that's going on? It's none of your business. Blah-de-blah-de. And that's so wrong, Paul. Really it is. This is annoying. What I want to say is, after everything we've been to each other, you really ought to trust me. But of course, you can't remember, so that's no good. The point is, you really do have to get involved, because it's very much to do with you. She hesitated, frowned. And me too, if you must know, because it's not just you they've got their claws into. It's me as well. Us, in fact. All of us. And that's just not right, because... Just a minute, Paul said grimly. What exactly is that supposed to mean, all of us? You mean it's not just... Her smirk was plain as anything, even through the blinding glow. Not just me. That's right. How many? That'd be telling. Oh, don't pull faces. Several, all right. No, it's not all right, Paul wailed. You make it sound like a harem or something. She giggled. You can be very sweet sometimes, you know that? All right, at least 3. Will that do? Anyway, we're doing the best we can, but there's ever so many more of them than there are of us, and sometimes they just don't play fair, and when we're gone, well, we're gone forever, and I really don't want to talk about that. I shouldn't be having to explain. It's your uncle's fault for not telling you when you were little, but you've got to be careful, Paul. You've got to pay attention is the main thing. I know you. For 2 pins you'll let the whole thing wash over you and carry on doing those stupid Mortensen things and never even notice who's not there. She paused, as if she expected him to react. He didn't. Now, I expect you're thinking I'm just a byproduct of really strong Canadian cheddar on top of a long, hard week. And of course you're absolutely right. But you're not imagining the pain in your hand. I can tell you that for nothing. I know it's all suddenly started piling in on top of you, like a bookshelf collapsing, but there's a reason for that. Obviously. I mean, men like your uncle don't up and die just like that. And I know they say, for tax reasons, and everybody assumes they know what that means, but there's a hell of a lot more to it. You take my word for it. It's war, Paul, and unless you get off your bum and start pulling your weight, we'll all be really screwed. And then where'll you be? Sleeping alone forever is where, and that'll be the least of your problems. Do you understand? No, Paul replied, with flawless honesty. I'll say this for you, though. You're an improvement on the one where I'm giving the prizes at speech day with no clothes on. But on balance, I think I'd rather get some sleep. Oh, you. She folded her arms and scowled at him. You're just going to have to pull yourself together, figure out your priorities, and which side your mirror's glazed on. Otherwise, it's all going to be a disgusting mess, and it'll be all your fault. Do you hear me? She leaned forward, and for a moment he thought he recognised her, except she couldn't be two people at once. Could she? She's counting on you, she said sternly, and there's nobody else who can help her except you. Now we've been to a lot of trouble, all of us. Your uncle even died. You've got everything you need, apart from the door, of course, but that can't be helped, and you'll be able to cope now. In any case, you're all set. Now it's time for you to stop lolling about, feeling sorry for yourself, and start fighting. Or next time, it won't just be a goblin who gets blown up. It'll be you. Then she turned off, just like a light, and at precisely the same moment, Paul felt the switch click between his fingers, and the bedside lamp came on. He thought for a moment. He said. Just a bad dream after all. It said something about the effects of overexposure to Mr. Tanner's mum, that his bad dreams featured lovely blondes. He relaxed a little and reached for his glass of water. For some reason his mouth was very dry indeed. As he picked it up, he dislodged something on the bedside table. Paul carried on and drank some water. It was only as he put the glass back that his conscious mind saw it, between the alarm clock and his watch. A rubber band. He jerked convulsively, spilling what was left of the water. Then he grabbed the rubber band and held it up to the light. Ridiculous thing to do. It was just a plain brown rubber band, such as the postman drops on your doorstep. That was how this particular specimen had entered his life. Sophie had found it there one morning. She had leaned forward to get it, and her hair had fallen in front of her face. That always annoyed her, so she'd used the band to tie it back, and forgotten to take it out and replace it with a toggle. For some reason, Paul had commented on it, jokingly said it suited her, and thereafter, until she went away, she'd always worn it in the evenings and at weekends, even though she claimed it pulled her hair and was uncomfortable. When she left, she either threw it away or took it with her, because it hadn't been there. He'd looked for it, sentimental clown that he was, even scrabbled about on his hands and knees in case it had fallen on the floor. He sat up in bed, with the band stretched around 4 fingers, staring at it. It couldn't be the same one. It had to be the one he'd absent-mindedly pocketed in the office, which had come out with his keys and handkerchief. Except that it wasn't. He knew it wasn't. And just to ram the point home as deep and firm as a vampire hunter's wooden stake, there was a single black hair still trapped inside it. Sophie's colour, Sophie's length. Fine, Paul heard himself think, but the girl who was here just now was a blonde. That worried him. Catching himself at a moment like this trying to figure out the mystery, Hercule Poirot in the library, instead of freaking out and screaming till they came for him in a plain van, was about as scary got. It hadn't been there before, but now it was back. Therefore, someone must have brought it. We won't go anywhere near the topic of how it came into that person's possession, in which case someone must have been here either earlier today or, God help us, just now. But in any case, why leave that of all things? Threat? Ransom demand? If people wanted to get in touch with him, why the hell couldn't they just write him notes, instead of cluttering up his life with cryptic artefacts? He caught sight of the clock. Mental arithmetic. If it's 3 a.m. in England, what time would it be in, say, Los Angeles? International Directory Inquiries gave him the number, and a cheerful voice with a Spanish accent told him he'd reached J.W. Associates, and how could she help him? He asked to speak to Miss Pettingell. Spanish accent was very sorry. Miss Pettingell wasn't in the office right then, but she'd be happy, deliriously so to judge by her tone of voice, to take a message. It's all right, thanks, Paul muttered. I'll call again later. Probably just as well. One doesn't call up one's ex-girlfriend on the other side of the world, probably dragging her out of a meeting with Leo's people and Julia's people and the numbers guys from Fox just to ask her if she knew what had become of the manky old ex-GPO rubber band. Paul didn't need to speak to her to know exactly what she'd say. His first name, caked in enough ice to preserve all the mammoths in Siberia. He could practically hear her saying it right now. Her voice was clear and sharp inside his head. Paul, help. He was out of bed and halfway across the room with a turn of speed that would have done credit to a greyhound, only pausing because he tried to run through the bedroom door without troubling to open it first. As he lifted his hand to rub his sadly used nose, he noticed that the band was still around his fingers. Frantically, he tried to shake it off, as though it was a spider in his hair, but it wouldn't leave him. Great! Not only am I finally losing it completely, I'm going to spend the rest of my life with a rubber band twined around my hand. That's going to play havoc with drinking tea and buttering toast. Then it occurred to him to use his left hand to peel the band off his right. That worked flawlessly, and he dropped the terrifying object on the floor. It'd be really nice, he reflected, if he was one of those people who had friends. Just pick up the phone any time, day or night, and they'd be there for you. Sorry to bother you, Philip or Chris or Justin, but just now I could have sworn I heard Sophie calling my name. Really? How fascinating. Did she say anything else? Actually, yes, she did. She said, help. Gosh, Paul, perhaps you'd better come over here and we can talk about it. Better still, stay there. I'll be round in about 10 minutes. That, he thought, would be really nice. Instead, I have to deal with it on my own. Just me. No friends. Paul sat up the rest of the night in the armchair with all the lights on, plus the TV, the radio and the CD player. It might as well have been unplugged because all he could hear was her voice. Paul, help. Not the most eloquent of speeches compared with, say, the Gettysburg Address or We Shall Fight Them on the Beaches. Memorable, though. Dead memorable. He got dressed at 6:15, had a slice of toast and a cup of black instant coffee at 6:15, and then sat by the door waiting for it to be time to go to work. Horribly, he'd rather be there than in his own home, which was no longer safe now that Sophie had come back to him. Paul, help. Yes, all right, I heard you the first time. He ended up outside 70 St Mary Axe at 9:20. The door was still firmly locked as usual. The memory of her voice was slightly weaker now. He actually had to think of it in order to hear it, but it was like a loose tooth, impossible not to keep fiddling away at it just to see if it was still there. On the other hand, it helped pass the time like nothing else on earth, because before he knew it, Mr. Tanner was standing next to him, shouting, I said a bit keen, aren't you? Not the sort of experience you can recover from instantly. Sorry, Paul mumbled. I couldn't sleep. So you came here? Yes. In preference to, say, counting sheep. That Tanner grin. Like mother, like son. Well, the Mordenson printouts ought to do the trick, but if not, come and see me. I've got some notes of meetings that'll tranquillise a rogue elephant. Mr. Tanner turned his key in the lock and stepped through the door. I suppose you might as well come in, he said. You've already met the menagerie, after all. Oh, in case I haven't mentioned it, if you ever do anything to encourage my mother, I'll rip your head off and hollow out your skull for a very small toilet bowl. The goblins were still out and about, scampering round reception in full armour, jumping on and off post table, eating the fax paper and the toner cartridges. Paul managed a wan smile and a faint wave, which he was vaguely touched to note they duly returned. And to think, not so long ago, something as homely and folksy as goblins wrecking the front office had been enough to freak him out for days. How far he'd come since then. Mr. Tanner was sifting the post. Interestingly, he used a pair of blacksmith's iron tongs for the purpose. So, he asked, not looking up, why the insomnia? Indigestion? Bad kipper? I have no conceivable reason to tell Mr. Tanner of all people about what I thought I saw last night. Mr. Tanner is not my friend, Mr. Tanner is half a goblin, and my boss. I had this really weird dream, Paul said. I get that a lot, Mr. Tanner said, but it doesn't matter with me, because it's all biochemistry and stuff. What'd you get in yours then? He made it sound like they were comparing sandwich fillings. Girls, Paul said, before he was ready. Right, Mr. Tanner said. Serves me right for asking. No, not like that. Shut up, Carpenter. Embarrassing yourself to death is a really tricky way to commit suicide, not to mention criminally inconsiderate. It was, well, this girl I knew. She was calling my name and saying help. This girl you knew, Mr. Tanner repeated. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't know any girls. He frowned, tongs extended towards a brown window envelope marked Inland Revenue. Not any more at any rate. She dumped you, right? That thin girl. Sophie, like it matters, but yes. Mr. Tanner put the tongs down on the desk. Was that who you heard then? Paul nodded wearily. Yes. So, Mr. Tanner broke off, fished in his pocket, brought out a huge blood-red handkerchief and sneezed violently. Bloody office cold, he muttered. You had it yet? It's a classic. You enjoy it. So you had a dream where Miss Pettingale was calling your name and pleading for help. Not pleading exactly, barking in exasperation for help. Yes, Paul said. Well, actually no, because that was after the dream, when I was awake. Mr. Tanner looked at him, like an early bird debating whether to send back an unsatisfactory worm. Then it can't have been a dream, can it? You only have them in your sleep. It's one of the salient features of dreams. You heard voices. I suppose so, Paul mumbled. Like Joan of Arc. Well, all right. Not quite like Joan of Arc, except that Sophie wasn't urging you to drive Peter Mail out of Provence. But you heard her voice and you were awake. Paul dipped his head. Yes, I see. Out of interest, why have you got a rubber band looped round your fingers? There was a short interlude, during which Paul had rather a lot of trouble breathing. Then he said "it" a couple of times. Mr. Tanner, oddly enough, was nodding his head. Hers, he said. Right? Right. Give it to me. Now, Mr. Tanner added quickly. Hold on a second. He picked up the tongs, used them to grip the band and tease it gently off Paul's wrist, like a detective retrieving a fibre sample from a murder scene. He dropped it in one of the empty envelopes, sealed it with sellotape, and put it away in his inside pocket. I'll hold on to that for you for a day or so, he said. You need to get some sleep sooner or later, or you'll be completely useless. He frowned and then used the tongs to push aside the lapel of Paul's jacket. That badge thing, he said. Paul had forgotten all about the Sea Scout badge and its painful effect on goblins. Sorry, he said guiltily. I hadn't realised it was still there. I'll put it away. No, don't do that. Mr. Tanner took the tongs away and stepped back, as if getting out of range. You hang on to that for a bit. You never know. He paused. Something was making him uncomfortable, as though he had a fishbone stuck in his throat. You know, he said, I'm sorry the way things turned out for you. Now you don't like it here and you'd far rather pack it in and quit. Unfortunately, he went on, looking at the frosted glass front window, that's not possible right now. But I just thought I'd tell you, it's not, well, anyway. Paul would have liked to say something at this point, but he had nothing worth making the effort for. Quite, Mr. Tanner said. Right, you get on with the Mortensons and let Julie know when you're finished. That's all. Paul wanted to fall asleep during the morning, curled up in a soft nest of computer printouts, but he seemed to have lost the knack. Can you forget how to sleep, he wondered? Do you have to go on special sleep training courses where they read you bits of railway timetables and literary criticism textbooks? He couldn't even persuade his mind to wander. He was focused, to his absolute amazement, on his work, to the point where he'd have missed lunch if someone hadn't knocked on his door and broken the spell. Hi, Mel said, poking her head around the door. Fancy coming out for lunch? To hell with it, Paul thought. Why not? Last night, during the long vigil, he'd been wishing more than anything that he had a friend, someone he could talk to about what he'd been through in the last week or so. Fool, he'd forgotten about his oldest friend of all. True, the issue was clouded somewhat by the fact that she was a girl, and he was, not beyond reasonable doubt, but on the balance of probabilities, in love with her. Stuff like that can clog your mind, like bits of rice and cold pasta gumming up a dishwasher. They didn't go to the Italian sandwich bar or the little Uzbek place. Instead, they wound up in a Burger King. Somehow, Paul felt this was a bit of the adolescence he'd never had, sitting on a plastic chair, drinking a milkshake through a straw with a girl he'd been at school with, though by right, in order to make it canonically correct, they should have been skiving off double maths. It reminded him of those letters that got lost in the post, and are finally delivered 30 years later. Something's bothering you, Mel said, looking at him with her head cocked on one side. You've got that bewildered look you used to get when you discovered you'd forgotten your PE kit. That obvious? She smiled. It's remarkable, she said, how little you've changed. Peter Pan almost. Makes me feel like it was only a few months ago we were at Laburnum Grove Primary. Paul thought about that. Odd, he said. I was thinking that you're the one who hasn't changed. Well, you've changed, obviously, he added quickly. But what made me think that was, well, how easily we're getting on, like we've picked up exactly where we left off 11 years ago. I didn't think people could do that. Depends on the people, Mel's replied. But don't change the subject. Something is bothering you, isn't it? Paul took a deep breath. Do you really want to hear about it? He said. It's long and pretty weird. Sounds interesting. Nah, he shook his head. It's got me in it, and I'm serious though. Can I tell you about it? The point is, he added before she could reply, you're, well, normal. In fact, you're the only normal person I know. Doesn't that make me exceptional then? Sorry, she added. Carry on. Really? Get on with it, for pity's sake. Paul paused for a moment, tidying the tumbled sock drawer of his thoughts. Well, he said, I won't start at the very beginning with me getting the job and everything, because there isn't time, and I don't like the sound of my own voice that much. I think this particular wave of bad stuff started when Sophie and I split up. Ah, Mel said. That sort of bad stuff. I'm quite high levels in that. Paul shook his head. It was rotten and horrible, he said. No question about it. But it wasn't weird. In fact, I'd pretty much guessed it was on the cards for some time. Well, right from the start, basically. I wasn't good enough for her, and that's all there is to it. Mels didn't say anything, but she was looking earnestly at him. Taking me seriously, he realised, with a faint shock of surprise and pleasure. So that's what it's like. Anyway, he continued, that wasn't weird. She goes off to California, and next thing I know, I'm transferred from General Office Dog's Body to trainee Dragon Slayer. She nodded gravely. I'm beginning to see where the weirdness comes in. Tell me, if Sophie hadn't got a transfer to LA, would she have been assigned to the dragon slaying department too? Paul acknowledged the merit of the question with a slight dip of the head. Don't know, he replied. The idea is, trainees spend 3 months or so in each department to find out what they're good at. But Benny, Mr. Shumway, the cashier, only he's also a dwarf and a hero part-time, he reckons you can't be a hero unless you're born to it. There was a lot of touchy-feely stuff about the nature of love, but I think the bottom line was that you've got to be such a sad loser that nobody'd miss you if you never came back. Convenient, Mel said thoughtfully. Your girlfriend dumps you, so suddenly you qualify. Did she want to go to California? Paul nodded. Yes, to get away from me, mostly, I think. Oh, well, Mel shrugged. Another finely crafted conspiracy theory bites the dust. So there you are, learning to be Conan the Barbarian. Not likely, Paul said with a faint grin. Mainly it's a cross between working in the planning office and the territorial army. Very boring, with little nuggets of real shit in it. You didn't take to it. Can you say out of place? Like a slug in a packet of crisps. Not my sort of thing at all. Apart from the paperwork and filling in the forms and stuff, that was boring. But at least I could handle it. Mels raised her eyebrows. But didn't you actually slay a real dragon? Oh, come on. It was about this long. He enclosed a trouser leg's length of air between his hands. And I killed it by accidentally sitting on it. If St. George ends up in the dole queue, it won't be because of me. How do you know that's not how he did it? And they changed the story a bit so as to look good in the paintings. Slaying dragons is slaying dragons, if you ask me. I couldn't do it. Yes, you could. Well, you're probably a lad at your tights, but that's about all. Anyway, no sooner have I sort of got the hang of being a hero, but I got transferred again. Not after 3 months, more like a few days. Melts rubbed her nose with her fingers, and through a small hole in time, Paul could see her doing exactly the same thing in the playground, albeit with shorter fingers and a frecklier nose. That's odd, she conceded, but not really weird. When you said weird, I was expecting magic and monsters and spoons bending for no apparent reason. Not sideways career moves. Paul sighed. If you want weird, brace yourself, because here it comes. First I got threatened by a talking bicycle who tells me freed the prisoners or you're dead. Then I find out my great-uncle Ernie was a magician too, just like the partners. So good, in fact, that they had him write a section in the office procedures manual. I'm guessing, but I wouldn't have thought they'd have asked him to do it if he wasn't some kind of leading expert. Then I get woken up by monsters in my own bedroom, telling me all sorts of cryptic stuff I don't understand, and then I hear that someone planted a bomb in my filing cabinet, and the whole office gets trashed. And then, Paul added bitterly, the fun begins. Turns out that whoever planted the bomb has kidnapped Benny Shumway and Ricky Wormtoter. There's nobody in the office except me who's qualified to rescue them, so I go to High Wycombe. Sorry, Mels interrupted. Did you just say... Paul nodded grimly. That's the portal between this world and the kingdom of the bloody Fae, apparently. So there's me, or rather me and Monica. Monica? My car, Mr. Wormtoter's sister, but also my car. We cross into the kingdom of the Fae, and we end up in this really nasty, creepy dungeon, along with Benny. And just as I'm being drawn to the sad conclusion that this time I'm really and truly fucked, Mr. Tanner's mum turns up out of the blue and rescues me. Not Benny, or Monica, or Ricky Wormtoter, mind me. Just a moment, Mel said. Mr. Wormtoter's sister is a car. Yes, at any rate, she is now. Before that, she was this tall brunette, but she got transformed. In the trade, you see, and I'm assuming they haven't figured out how to turn her back yet. Either that or she prefers it. I really don't know. She's a pretty good car, I'll say that for her. 40 to the gallon, and her exhaust... Fine, Mel said firmly. Mind you, I think you're breaking the cardinal rule of office survival. Don't drive the boss's sister. But you were saying, Mr. Tanner's mother... rescued me. Paul turned his head away slightly. I think I told you, she's got this thing about me. God only knows why. It's a bit sick if you ask me, her being a goblin and all. But she's got her good points, no doubt about it. She helped me with that stupid little dragon and fetched me out of that dungeon, and really, I thought I'd had it that time. Melts nodded. But she didn't rescue the others. No, apparently she could only take back one of us. I mean, imagine Benny's going to be fairly conclusively pissed off with both of us when he gets home. You think they'll be able to rescue him then? Already done, apparently. The firm brokered a deal of some sort through a bunch of weirdos in an old warehouse in Bermondsey. Oh, Melds looked surprised. More so than when Paul had told her about their capture in the first place. Well, that's good. And how about Mr. Wormtoter and what's her name? Them too, so I'm told. The funny thing, though, is that when I got back from Wickham, the first thing I did was barge into the Countess's office wanting to know what they were going to do about Benny and Monica, and she downright refused to do anything. Nothing anybody could do, she said. And now, quite suddenly, they've been released. They're on their way home, apparently. Melts thought for a moment. She thought very fetchingly. A slight frown, a wrinkle of the nose. Maybe not so strange, she said. Like, these creeps who captured you were the rebel faction in the Fae Civil War, right? And the Countess, isn't she the rightful queen of the Fae? Maybe when she said there was nothing she could do, she was thinking about, the military option, going in there like the SAS and bursting them out by force. Then she had a quiet think about it, or maybe these rebels came through with their demands for releasing the hostages. She negotiates, give them what they want, or some of it, and hey presto, they've got a deal. Paul nodded. That makes sense. God, that's a change. I'm so used to everything being bizarrely inexplicable. Maybe I've stopped looking for reasonable explanations. Wouldn't blame you if you had, Melt said sympathetically. I mean, it's one thing to hear you talk about it. Must be something else actually having it happen to you. For instance, the bloody bike turned up again, for one thing, and luckily I think I'd worked out how to scare it off. Turns out it's allergic to names. Allergic? It's like names hurt it when it hears them, so all you've got to do is say a whole list of them, John, Fred, Clive, Rachel, and it runs away. Curiously, Paul added, the nutters in Bermondsey I told you about were the same way. And I think I may have seen the rogue bike in their warehouse place while I was there. Or, he added, it could have just been, a bike. A non-rogue one. Does seem more likely, doesn't it? Oh, and then there was my Uncle Ernie's stuff. Apparently he died. Mells was frowning again. Didn't I meet your Uncle Ernie once, when we were kids? I doubt it. I don't remember him at all. Her face lit up. Got it, she said. I came to tea at your house when we were very small. Not just me. I think you'd invited the whole class over for your birthday or something. That's it. It was your birthday party, and I was really jealous because you had a real-life conjurer. And you told me it's not like that. We're not paying for him or anything. He's actually my uncle. Your Uncle Ernie. Paul thought hard. Now Mills came to mention it, he remembered the party, his 9th birthday, and he remembered the conjurer. Vaguely, though. He couldn't picture the man's face or anything. That was him? I'm sure it was. Tall man, very thin, bold, with a big nose and bushy eyebrows. I was scared stiff of him at first because he looked so fierce and sort of wizardly, but then he started smiling and telling very funny jokes, and I wasn't scared any more. Oh, Paul said. I wish I had a memory. It'd come in very handy. So he was actually real then? I was beginning to wonder whether he wasn't some sort of, trick. People were playing on me. Mel shrugged. So he died then? He must have been pretty ancient, because he looked to be about 110 when we were kids. Mind you, grown-ups always look old when you're that age, so he may only have been 60 or something. I'm sorry to hear that, though, she added. He was a really good conjurer. Anyhow. Paul laughed. Maybe he was cheating, using real magic instead of proper sleight of hand. Anyway, the point is, I got this letter from my parents saying his stuff was with this firm of solicitors. They didn't want it, so if I went and got it, I could keep it. So I did. Bastards charged me £100, he added sourly. And then, when I got it back to the office, it turned out to be all this really powerful magic gear, anti-goblin charms, and a load of things Mr. Tanner's mum told me were too dangerous to leave lying around, so she took them off me and put them in the strong room. A curious look came into Meltz's eyes. Really? Why? Paul shrugged. For safekeeping, I suppose, so they wouldn't cause accidents or something. You're sure she didn't really want them for herself? If they were dead powerful, I mean. That thought hadn't even occurred to Paul. I wouldn't have thought so, he said. I mean, the shield thing, she couldn't bear to touch it, or burned her, she said. Or perhaps she was just pretending it hurt, so if it got stolen, you'd never think it was her that took it. Have you been to check it's all there? As a matter of fact, no. I mean, if she wants it, as far as I'm concerned, she can have it. The last thing I want is more weirdness. Maybe it's valuable, Meld said. Could be worth a lot of money if it's rare magic equipment. Paul considered that. I don't think goblins care a lot about money. I remember someone telling me they're all filthy rich anyway, because of mineral rights and God knows what. I could well believe her nicking it to do mischief with, but not just so that she could flog it for cash. Well, Meld scowled. She had a sweet scowl. Dear God, Paul thought, listen to me. How can anybody have a sweet scowl? I know it's wrong, and I'm probably not really supposed to think it, let alone say it, but I don't like the goblins. Any of them. I think they're disgusting and vicious and nasty. You should see the claw marks on the front desk some mornings, when there's a lot of posts to be sorted. Sometimes Mr. Tanner doesn't do a thorough job of magicking them away. It's scary, Paul. Paul grinned. Did I tell you about the time I faced down a whole gang of armed goblins with nothing but a stapler? That's how I met Mr. Tanner's mum, actually. You see, they'd kidnapped... He hesitated. The night when the goblins abducted Sophie, and he'd gone charging off after them, their spears and swords and axes against his anger and fear of losing her, and he'd won. Somehow it didn't seem right telling Melds about that, best friend or not. They'd kidnapped one of the staff, and I confronted them, just sort of said boo, and they all ran away. Honestly, so long as you're careful, they're the least of your worries. Really, to tell you the truth, I'm far more frightened of the Countess Judy's lot, the Fae. Now, they give me shivers down the spine. Oh, Melds looked at him and then shrugged. Well, anyway, God, is that the time? We're late. When Paul got back to his office, the pile of Mortensen printouts had quadrupled, to the point where he was afraid for the desk they sat on. Bloody hell, he groaned, and then saw a handwritten note on top of the pile. P.A.C. JDCB wants these done by the time you go home tonight. If you can't finish before 5:30, don't worry, she's working late and will unlock the front door. Julie. JDCB. He had to think for a while before he figured it. Judy de Castelbianco. Vindictive cow, he thought. There was absolutely no way he was going to be able to wade through all that garbage in one afternoon. More to the point, it looked like he'd be there till midnight at the very least. Still, it wasn't as though he had any choice in the matter. If she wanted to put him in this place by giving him a double detention, she could do that. Bugger. At 5:30, Paul's attention was disturbed by scratching sounds at the door. The goblins were used to having the run of the place once the front door had been shut. The light on in his office was probably bugging the hell out of them. He scowled, took out the Sea Scout's badge and jerked the door open. Sure enough, on the other side were 2 or 3 goblins, crouched down where they'd been trying to peer through the keyhole. Sorry, chaps, Paul said sternly. This office is off limits for tonight. When the nearest goblin lifted his head and growled at him, he stuck out his hand with the badge in it and slowly opened his fingers. The result was instantaneous and really rather pleasing. He had heard the expression of falling over each other in their haste many times, but he hadn't realised before what an amusing spectacle it could be. Grinning broadly, he shut the door. 6 o'clock, 6:30, 7. He was tired and hungry and very, very bored, and he was still only just halfway through. He felt a yawn bubbling up inside him, like a belch of lava welling up from the magma level in the throat of a volcano. Can't fall asleep, he told himself. Can't go to sleep. Got to finish or be here all night. The pile of Mortensen printouts was actually rather comfortable to rest one's head on. The infinite layers formed a wonderful laminated cushion. A bright spark could make money patented. Paul could see the office very clearly, which was odd since he knew his eyes were closed. He could see himself zizzing happily. He looked so peaceful like that, he decided. It'd be a crime to wake him. The door opened, but not the boring old everyday door in the doorframe. This door appeared suddenly out of the wall, and it looked rather familiar. I know that door, he thought. I'd know it anywhere. A door that appears out of nowhere, coming through the wall. When is a door not a door? Easy. But that was odd too, because he had lent Ricky Wormtaw to the Acme portable door, his wonderful, secret, get-out-of-mortal-peril-free gadget, and Ricky had got himself captured. Maybe this was Ricky coming home, with Benny and Monica. Wrong. The door swung open wide, an arm reached out through it and wedged it open with a thick, heavy book, which Paul recognised as the office procedures manual. It wasn't a particularly frightening arm. It wasn't green and scaly or grey with shrivelled skin clean to the bone. In fact, it was wearing lilac with patterns in silver glitter. A kid's arm, followed a second later by a kid. Paul wasn't terribly good at telling children apart, but he knew this one. The name escaped him, but he remembered that she was a real hotshot with a box spanner and a torque wrench. Behind her came the other half a dozen or so kids he'd seen at the garage in the middle of nowhere. Behind them, at least 30 children he didn't recognise. School trip, he assumed, or someone's birthday treat. No grown-ups, though. Still, it was only a dream, so sod it. Paul could see them looking cautiously at him, checking he really was fast asleep before tiptoeing past him, round the corner of his desk towards the door. The thing that struck him most about them was how very unchildlike they were, in spite of their round pink faces, out-of-proportion heads and scuffed knees. No child that age has lived long enough to have learned how to move so silently, so carefully, so earnestly. It was like watching Commandos or the SAS, not a crocodile of truant 9 and 10-year-olds. Not kids, something else pretending to be human children. He thought, creepy. Glad I'm asleep and I don't have to see this. He counted them. 48. When the last one had emerged from it, the portable door rolled itself neatly into a scroll, fell to the floor and vanished. The children, meanwhile, were sneaking out of the office. The last one closed the door softly behind her, and then Paul woke up. According to his watch, it was nearly 9 o'clock. Fuck, he thought. For all I know, Countess Judy's already buggered off, and I'm stuck in the building all night. One thing was fairly certain. There was no way he was going to finish this pile of printouts now. If he tried, he would certainly be asleep again within 5 minutes. All he could think of to do was go straight to Countess Judy's office, and if she was still there, admit his failure and ask to be let out of the office. If she wasn't there, he'd been rather dismissive of the threat posed by Goblins earlier, possibly because at the back of his mind he'd known that he had the Sea Scout badge. Query, however, would the badge, coupled with his fearsome reputation as a scarer of goblins, be enough to save him from having his throat cut in his sleep? Good question, to which he really didn't want to learn the answer. All in all, he was enormously relieved to see a wedge of light showing under the Countess's door. Paul took a deep breath and knocked. No answer. He waited, counted to 50, knocked again. This time the Countess's voice snapped. "Come in," and he turned the handle. "Mr. Carpenter," she said. She was looking sterner and more intimidating than he'd ever seen her. Her cheekbones were sharp as ploughshares, and her eyes were cold and silvery grey. For all that, something he saw at the corner of his eye distracted him. I'm very sorry," Paul said, "but I haven't managed to finish the Mortensons he sent down. I promise I'll stay late tomorrow." "Yes," she said, "you will. And now I suppose I'd better let you out. Follow me." As Paul left the office, however, he couldn't resist glancing quickly round, just for a lightning-fast peek. When he'd entered the room, he'd seen the drawer of the Countess's filing cabinet, the same one he'd manhandled all over the place for Julie a few days back, twitch, then close silently, all by itself. Now, as he left, he could see it very slowly and tentatively slide open. Furthermore, he had a pretty strong feeling that he wasn't supposed to have seen anything of the kind. Paul could hardly keep his eyes open on the bus home, but as soon as he unlocked his front door, he felt wide awake. All night sleep evaded him like the last unpaired sock in the drawer. Counting sheep was pointless, counterproductive even. All he saw when he closed his eyes was a gaggle of school kids tiptoeing through a hole in his office wall. He tried turning on the TV, since television hardly ever failed to put him to sleep, but even the Open University, Channel 4 arts programmes, and reruns of martial law couldn't do the trick. He drifted off for a few minutes around 5 a.m, but was jerked awake by a loud bang. For some reason he imagined it was the slamming of a door, but it turned out to be nothing more than generic baddies blowing up something or other in the course of some ineffable thriller. In desperation, he dragged himself to his feet and did an hour and a half of ironing before running himself a consolatory bath. It turned into the dreariest week of Paul's life. When he arrived at the office, the Mortensen mountain had at least doubled, and on his chair was a terse note from Countess Judy, reminding him that he had undertaken to clear the lot before leaving the building. Unfortunately, his rate of progress soon slowed from pathetic to derisory, as a sleep that avoided him all night came swooshing back like an angry tide. No matter what he tried, quadruple black coffee from the machine, pinching his arms, stabbing the point of the scissors into the palms of his hands, nothing could induce his eyes to stay open once he focused them on a sheaf of Mortensons. It had to be some kind of self-induced hypnotism, he reckoned, a smart conclusion which, once arrived at, didn't appear to help in the slightest. 3 times before lunch, Julie caught him mid-doors. Each time the first he knew about it was a soft click of the door, and there she'd be, standing over him with a look of contempt on her face and yet more bloody printouts. "You're not making a very good job of this, are you?" she said the 4th time. Waking up just a conventional once a day was bad enough for Paul, who wasn't a morning person, being exploded out of slumberland over and over again in the space of a few hours. "No," he mumbled. "Don't know what the problem is, really." The click of Julie's tongue was like a Prussian officer's heels on a parade ground. "Staying up all night, boozing and partying, being in no fit state to come to work," she snapped. "Just don't let Mr. Tanner catch you, that's all. Otherwise you'll be looking for a new job by the end of the week." Please, Paul thought, pretty please with pink icing and ribbon. "Couldn't sleep last night," he tried feebly to explain. "Overtired, probably. Maybe I'm coming down with something." Julie didn't dignify that with a reply, and Paul couldn't really blame her. If he'd repeatedly walked in and found someone zonked out on the desk each time, he too would have naturally assumed that the burning smell in the air was both ends of the candle, remorselessly incinerated by a hopeless debauchee. When lunchtime eventually dragged round, he toyed with the idea of nipping out and getting some fresh air. But the ghastly thought of what would be said to him if Countess Judy dropped by while he was out and found the snow-capped Mortensen range ungarrisoned was more than he could bear. He stayed at his post, struggled and slept. Occasionally he caught snatches of dreams. It was a bit like switching on the last 5 minutes of the film. Sometimes there were kids sneaking through doors. Sometimes he was in the main boardroom, the one with the imp-reflecting tabletop, with old Mr. Wells, the senior partner, trying to explain the whole wretched business to him, but unable to make himself understood because he'd caught the office cold and was constantly interrupted by a barrage of artillery-grade sneezing. In one dream, he was in the land of the dead. He'd gone to do the banking, as usual, but Mells had wandered off and got herself trapped in the dungeons of Grendel's aunt. He dashed off to find help and got completely lost. And now he was being chased across the asphodel fields by a pack of his relatives, led by Uncle Ernie, all howling like dogs and demanding to know why he never answered letters. "This isn't good enough," Countess Judy told Paul at 8 o'clock that night, when he'd reported in to confess a second day of failure. "Go home, go straight to bed, get some sleep, and be damn sure you get the job finished tomorrow. That's all I can say." But that night was just as bad as the night before, and the night after, no sleep, just aching, intolerable boredom. Paul tried the fresh air approach at lunchtime the next day, walking briskly through the city until his feet were blistered. But the only result was deeper gloom and further despair. Every time he passed a child or a group of children in the street, and either there were an awful lot of them out and about during the daytime, or he was noticing them more than usual. He could have sworn blind that he recognised their nasty, grinning faces from his fragmented dreams. He didn't need to be a doctor to figure that one out. Sleep deprivation, stress, and a light overall garnish of loathing and terror. Not the best week of his life so far. Paul's luck broke on Friday night. He'd been given one last chance, work all weekend and get the backlog cleared before it formed a critical mass and screwed up the Earth's orbit, or else. Resigned to not sleeping yet again, he'd resolved to pass the time by painting the living room ceiling. He'd got the furniture covered in old sheets, set up the ladder and dipped his little squidgy foam mop in white emulsion, when quite suddenly his eyes closed and nothing he could do would induce them to open again. He groped his way to the dust-sheet-strewn sofa. He felt the emulsion tray get kicked over en route, but there wasn't anything he could do about that, and flopped down with the mop still in his hand. When his eyes eventually opened, the room was full of light and his watch said 9:15. Paul just made it to St. Mary Axe by 10, which was his appointed time. He was still wearing Friday's clothes, stylishly, though eccentrically enhanced by a big white rectangle on the left knee of his trousers. Countess Judy gave him a very quick glance, held the door open for him, and went away without a word. Even the goblins gave him a wide berth. As he approached, the little knots and gangs of them he encountered in the corridors and on the stairs immediately went very quiet and backed hastily away, which he reckoned was a bit much. Needless to say, none of them came anywhere near him all day. But at 11:15 that night, Paul carefully laid the last printout on the last pile, taking exaggerated care to line its edges up perfectly with the sheet underneath. He could feel his brain trying to force its way past his eyes and eardrums as it boiled and seethed with boredom, but he'd got the job done, and he hadn't fallen asleep once. In spite of everything, he couldn't help feeling, yes, damn it, actual, genuine pride. Something ludicrously pointless and stupid attempted. Something done. Go tell the Spartans and all that. He stood up. His legs appeared to have forgotten how to do the standing up business, and it was a second or so before it came back to them, and spent a whole 2 minutes just gazing at the vast array of neat, orderly paper bundles. Thank God, he thought, that my office hasn't got a window, because this is precisely the moment in every comedy film ever made where a sudden gust of wind scatters the lot. Not wind, sure, but goblins. Goblins with the run of the place. Dozens or even hundreds of malignant, scampering non-humans who most of all just want to have fun, preferably by breaking and spilling things. The mental image was more than he could bear. But just as Paul had resigned himself to standing guard until Monday morning, inspiration struck. He took his Sea Scout badge, gave it a quick buff on his lapel, and laid it on top of the bundle nearest the door. Joy, he thought. Joy isn't anything I've imagined it to be over the last 20-odd years. It's not Christmas, or true love, or chocolate ice cream, or even getting out of the dungeons of the Fae. It's finishing this. Something so simple, yet so unspeakably wonderful. Paul was just about to turn off the light when he stopped, went over to the long blank wall opposite his chair and studied it, inch by inch. Nothing there, needless to say. No goblin scratches, nor faint warmth to the touch, nor slight clamminess where something had adhered to it by suction, nor faint lines or cracks in the plaster to indicate a cunningly hidden seam. Another aspect of this overriding joy. By Monday he'd be healed. He wouldn't see doors in walls or be convinced that he knew the face of every bubblegum-chomping brat he passed in the street. All he'd have to put up with would be talking bicycles, extortionate lawyers' fees, the Bank of the Dead, his own shortcomings as a human being, and Mr. Tanner's mum. And he'd have Sunday off as well. Joy! Paul shook his head, closed the door gently to avoid making a draught, and went home.